Yes, Bob.
If you would like and would make me co-host, I'll watch the room and let people in.
Okay, I don't know how to do that.
Oh, just put your cursor on my name to the right.
Uh-huh.
And there where it says more, I think it'll say make co-host. You see that? If not, don't worry about it.
Okay, well, I see where it says make host. Is that the same thing?
No, well, no, co-host would be better.
Yeah, it doesn't have co-host, just has host. So maybe I better leave it. But oh, there we go. Can you see that? Uh-oh, where'd everybody go? Let me try to start screen share.
Significant weather advisory.
Uh-oh. There we go. All right. So once again, if you have a question or comment, feel free to just pause, stop me, and just ask the question. In the meantime, if you think you have something going on in the background, it'd be a good idea to keep your mic muted in the meantime. All right, so tonight we're going to look at everything below this line right here. This is the beginning of the persecution by the Jews of the Christians. And we're going to go right up to the time that the New Testament is canonized. And that's the jargon word, which means recognized as the official version. So there are a lot of different things to talk about in the meantime, and we'll get there. So first thing I wanted to just remind everybody about, it's just such an amazing thing. The Christian religion is the largest religion in the world with approximately 2 billion followers. And it all started from 12 of these guys who are relatively unremarkable fishermen, not particularly necessarily well educated at all. And yet these 12 guys take the message of Christ and continue to spread it, and it continues to grow and grow and grow. Well, they had some supernatural help, and that came in the form of the Holy Spirit, who basically baptized all of the believers at Pentecost. Pentecost is the word pent is the similar for a pentagon. It has to do with 5. In this case, it's 50, and it's 50 days after the resurrection, after Easter. And this is the day that the disciples were gathered in the upper room, which is also where they had received the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, the communion. And the Holy Spirit descends on them and empowers them. And so this is called the birthday of the church, because up until this point, the disciples are afraid of being arrested. They are afraid of having a similar fate to what Jesus encountered. So they're kind of laying low. And after this, they're emboldened and they go out. And the book of Acts tells us that they made 3,000 converts to Christianity in this one day, the day of Pentecost. So there are a lot of different days you could probably look at as the birthday of the church, but this is certainly a very, very important day. It's why we continue to mark the day. So shortly after Pentecost, Stephen, who is one of the early followers of Christ, is becoming very effective in preaching. And the Jewish leaders have him arrested. They put him on trial. And at the trial, he begins to talk about his faith in Christ. And they just go crazy. And they take him outside and they stone him. And I like this part here. They put their hands over their ears and began shouting. And it just reminded me when I was a kid and I would be winning an argument with my sister, Lisa. That's exactly what she would do. She put her hands over her ears and start going, blah, 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 I can't hear you. And so it's very similar. It's a very interesting thing. So they They put their hands over their ears. They rush him outside. This is an underplay because I can imagine that there were a lot more people involved, and they stone him to death. And this is the first time we encounter Saul, who then goes on to become the Apostle Paul. At this point, he's watching the coats and the jackets or the robes of the people who are probably stoning Stephen so that they can get a good throw in. They got to take their cloak off, and Paul's kind of guarding their cloaks while they're doing this. So he's approving it and thinking it's a good idea. Following the stoning of Stephen, a wave of persecution begins, according to Acts. It sweeps over the church in Jerusalem, and the believers are scattered throughout the region of Judea and Samaria. So that is basically the northern and the southern parts of Israel. And the Bible tells us that Saul was a huge part of the persecution, trying to destroy the church, going around arresting people to throw them into jail, and even approving of them being put to death. And he's on a mission to go do that in Damascus, where there are lots of Jews living. And as he's on the way, this light falls around him. This story is told 3 times in the New Testament, twice in Acts and once in Galatians. And the light falls on him, and he says, and he hears a voice from heaven saying, "Why are you persecuting me?" And he says, "Who are you?" And Jesus replies, "I'm Jesus, the one you're persecuting." And he is struck blind for 3 days. And when he recovers through the laying on of hands, he then goes on to become the Apostle Paul. And now he begins to preach Christianity. So this is the third place where the story appears in Galatians. And after his experience, he goes into the region of Syria for several years, and then he comes back to Jerusalem. And it says he meets with James, the Lord's brother. And from this, and from the second verse here, we realize, or we learn, that James, the brother of Jesus, has become one of the pillars of the church, the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. And this is right here is called an ossuary. It's a bone box, and I may have mentioned this to you last time, but in those days, because the ground is so hard, it's all stone, tombs are reused. And so after the person's body has decayed and there's nothing left but but bones, they gather them and put them in these stone caskets. So this is actually about 2 feet high and about 3 feet long and about 1.5 feet wide. And sometimes this would hold the bones of several family members. Now, what's key about this particular one is this was bought by a collector in Jerusalem about 30 years ago. It sat in his living room for 25 years. And about 5 years ago, a friend of his was over and he looked and saw this inscription carved into the side. And being an expert in ancient Hebrew, he read it, and it says, "James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus." And so this created an enormous stir in Israel. The Israeli Antiquity Authority is a very huge thing because there are so many antiques all over the place in Israel, and there's so much 3,000-year-old stuff all over the place that they have this whole authority. It's like a department of the government. And they actually sued this guy. They had all kinds of scientists analyze this thing, and they finally, in the end, determined that it's not a fraud. They didn't go ahead and say, well, it's really definitely the brother of Jesus, but it dates to the time of Jesus, and it basically is probably the actual final resting place of the bones of Jesus' brother, which is just kind of an interesting thing. This is a close-up of the inscription. And it's harder to read up close, but just wanted to give you an idea. The box was made out of limestone and is roughly carved into a square by just chipping away the pieces. And so it's a rather rough, it's not a smooth, highly decorated piece. So one of the things that's important to mention is that there are a lot of ladies, women, who are recognized as leaders in the early church. And this is important because the Apostle Paul gets the knock of being a misogynist and being against women. And there is some evidence for that in his second letter to Timothy. He talks about how he doesn't allow women to have authority over men, and he wants them to be silent in church. But yet, in several places in Scripture, he talks about these, particularly in Romans, these women who are helpers of his. And so these are folks who are serving in the church. Phoebe is a deacon. Junia is respected among the apostles, which means that she's a leader of the early church. Julia has believers meeting in her house. Lydia also having the Apostle Paul stay with her and becomes a supporter of the early church, if not a leader. And Priscilla, a co-worker in the ministry of Christ. So when people tell you that Paul is a misogynist, you can say, well, the jury is mixed on that, because he recognized and worked with women as leaders in the church. This is also one of the reasons why the Methodist Church, as opposed to the Catholic Church, believes in ordaining women as pastors, because there's a lot of biblical evidence for that, whereas in the Catholic tradition, they just ignore all of this and they focus in on Paul's letter to Timothy, in which he says women shouldn't have authority over men. So the Roman Empire, again, we're talking about 3,000 miles from end to end. It's quite a huge area, and they control this entire area for several hundred years. And the time that they control it is called the Pax Romana, which is the Roman peace. And that's because they control everything. And they institute peace in the whole area. And they allow trading in the whole area. And so when Paul goes on his missionary journeys around this area, he's more easily able to travel because the Romans are controlling this whole area, and it's safe. It's not like there's pirates or bandits, something like that he has to worry about. The other thing to just point out, in all these places that Paul goes to on his missionary journey, he goes first to the synagogue, which means that there are Jewish folks in all these places. His plan is to go first and try and reach the Jews, and then to speak to the Gentiles in the area. He wants to give the Jews the first crack at it, but they don't always, of course, go along, and neither do the Gentiles, but always. But he does find Jews in all these locations, and that's because of the Roman peace. The Jewish traders are able to spread throughout the Mediterranean region, and so wherever Paul goes, he finds Jewish folks who he can talk to about the Messiah. And they're already expecting a Messiah, looking for a Messiah, and perhaps then more open to that. So the persecution of Christians begins with the Jews, the Jewish leaders, who had Jesus put to death, and who also had Stephen put to death. And then it intensifies with the Emperor Nero. Now, Paul is arrested by the Romans, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And he appeals eventually to the emperor, and that turns out to be a bad idea, and we'll talk about that. But the reason I have these lines here I wanted to just show the connection. When there's a gap in persecution, when there's a new emperor, he doesn't want to persecute the Christians. He has a different attitude than the previous emperor. And so there's a gap. But then at other times, there's no gap, because here between Trajan and Hadrian, there's a continuation. So you have a whole 40 years of persecution, and then you go right from Hadrian right into Antonius, and you get another number of years, and then you go all the way to 180. Marcus Aurelius, who's a famous philosopher and emperor, also persecuted Christians, and I'll talk why that is in a moment. So you see, we have a very long period of time from 98 to 180, basically continual persecution by the Romans of the Christians. Now, this is not a systematic, organized, wipe out the Christians type movement. It's just localized in Rome and some other places. And so it all comes to an end finally in 306. But so you're looking at almost 300 years of persecution by the Romans of the Christians. So Paul gets arrested in Jerusalem because the mob sees him in the temple, and they think that he has brought some non-Jews into the temple area. So he gets arrested. A riot breaks out. They're going to drag him out just like they did with Stephen, and start beating him. They want to try and kill him, and the Romans arrest him. Remember, I was talking last time about how they could see the temple area from their fortress, and so they're looking down. They see this uproar going on. They run down, and immediately, before Paul can be seriously injured or killed, they rescue him by arresting him, but they don't know why he's being arrested. So after they arrest him, a couple days later, they put him on trial with the Jewish authorities. And this is, again, showing the political connection between Rome and the Jewish authorities. The Jewish authorities have the power to try people, but when Paul is on trial, he then gets put on trial with the Romans, because they're trying to figure out, well, we've arrested him. What charge should we bring against him? And eventually he winds up in Caesarea, where he's there for 2 years in prison, and then he appeals to the emperor. So I thought this was interesting. This verse always struck me. Paul, I think, picks the wrong time to appeal to the emperor. And my question is, was he under the wrong impression? Because when you read this in Romans, here's what he says: everyone must submit to the governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. Do what is right, and they will honor you. And so we read that and compare that to the actions of Nero, who was the emperor, and we see that he doesn't really do what is right, and he doesn't honor people for doing what's right. Now, Nero saw Christians as a convenient scapegoat. There was a suspicious fire that broke out in a part of Rome that Nero wanted to have to build his palace, new palace. And so to deflect, basically what it wiped out a whole bunch of people's houses. And there was a lot of anger and resentment, and people were blaming Nero. And so he wanted to deflect blame, and so he blamed the Christians and began persecuting Christians. And now Tacitus is a Roman historian, and he says that Christians were treated with dreadful cruelty, covered with the skins of wild beasts, and left to be eaten by dogs, nailed to a cross, burned alive, and set on fire as torches at night. And this is a painting entitled Nero's Torches, and you can see these folks are up here on poles. They're wrapped to, and fire is being prepared for them to be burned. This is a mosaic from a Roman house in Rome, and it shows the gladiators' games. And here's a person, probably like they were talking about. He's put on a cart, he's tied up, and he's being fed to what looks like a leopard. And here's a guy being thrown to the lions. And so that's a pretty good record. That's as good of a record as we get. They don't, of course, have photographs in those days, but this is a good illustration. So eventually, the Apostle Paul is beheaded in Jerusalem. In the meantime, though, Christianity is already spreading at the time that he's writing his letters, which is around 60 to 70 AD. Christianity has already been spreading into the emperor's own household. So it's spreading around the whole Roman Empire. The Apostle Peter is also put to death at this time during Nero's persecutions. The Apostle Peter asked to be crucified. They were going to crucify him, but he asked to be crucified upside down because he felt he didn't want to take away anything from the glory of Christ. So the tradition is that he was crucified upside down. So one of the interesting facets of Christian history of this time is that it is a 300-year period of continual persecution, and yet at the same time, the church is growing. It's kind of like the Romans are trying to squash the religion, and all that happens is it spreads out. Instead of being squashed and crushed, it just spreads out and continues to grow. So the pagans, the Romans, are suspicious of the Christians for several reasons. The first one, the most important one, is that they refuse to worship the Roman gods. And if you are a Roman and you're worshiping these gods, and these fellows refuse to worship your gods, and you tolerate them, then maybe your gods are going to be angry at you. And maybe if they're tolerated by the nation will be in trouble because they're tolerating them. So Christians are seen as unpatriotic to Rome, and possibly even dangerous to Rome. Also, they're blamed as being promiscuous, because Paul talks about greeting other Christians with a holy kiss. And they're also talked about as being cannibals because of a misunderstanding of the sacrament of communion, where Jesus, says, "This is my body, this is my blood." So they're accused of being cannibals. So basically, they're easy targets for the Romans. So in 68 AD, one of the reasons why the many Jews did not accept Christ is because he was not the kind of Messiah they thought he was going to be. In 68 AD, there was another fellow who claimed to be the Messiah, and he claimed to be ordained by God to fight against the Romans and to reestablish the Jewish nation. So they rebelled against Rome, and the Romans don't like that when that happens. So there were two major battles. The Romans come back in, and they bring 4 legions. A Roman legion is 6,000 soldiers.
Oh my gosh.
And they bring 4 legions to fight against the Jews. Now this is Masada. This is a 16-acre mountaintop. The flat part is 16 acres, which is fairly good sized. This was actually built by King Herod as one of his palaces. And it actually has a swimming pool. It has a steam room. The Romans built a steam room, if you can believe that, on top of this mountain in the desert. This is the Dead Sea back here. Herod had an aqueduct that ran all the way. There's a hillside just outside of the vision of this mountain right to the left. and he had an aqueduct run all the way to there so he could get water. And there are all kinds of gigantic cisterns in here to hold thousands and millions, maybe even, of gallons of water. He had big storehouses of food up here. And so when the Jews rebelled against the Romans, they retreated to this fortress because they thought it was very impregnable by the Romans. And it is very, you know, imagine trying to climb up here to fight somebody. You know, it's just crazy. So right here, the Romans built a siege ramp so that they could get up and breach the walls. But before they did that, they completely encircled this mountain with troops. And you can just barely make out this square right here and another one right here. And those are the remains of the Roman camps where the headquarters of 2 of the legions were. And this right here is part of the wall that they used to encircle all the way around to prevent anybody from escaping. So when they finally breach the walls with their siege ramps and everything, they find that everybody up here has committed suicide rather than be taken prisoner by the Romans. And they have drawn lots. A couple guys kill people, and then eventually there's only 2 left. And I guess maybe one guy commits suicide because in the Jewish religion, suicide is a sin. But if you kill somebody else in a situation like that, it's not a sin. So to this day, the Jewish soldiers, when they get sworn in, they come up here to take their vow as a symbol of Jewish independence and Jewish resolve to not surrender. So this is the beginning of the end of Israel, really, as a nation. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so this is the Roman general who leads the siege. He's Vespasian, and he becomes then emperor. But he also leads the siege of Jerusalem. And the siege of Jerusalem is 5 months long. They do a similar thing where they build a wall all the way around the fortress of Jerusalem. And they have their 4 legions encircling Jerusalem. And sorry, that's my iPad. Somehow it thought I said, "Hey Siri," and wanted me to talk about Jerusalem. Anyway, sorry about that. So Vespasian encircles Jerusalem, and they have 3 defensive walls. This is the outer wall, and then they have a second defensive wall, and then a third defensive wall. And it takes 5 months for them to break through all of these walls because there are about 15,000 armed militia. They're not really soldiers, but they're militia inside this area, and they keep fighting successfully against the Romans for 5 months. And finally the Romans break down the walls, and then they break down the temple, and then they burn the whole place down. And there's a museum in Jerusalem called the Burnt House, or the Burnt House. And archaeologists found a house that had been burned. They traced the date of it to the time of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. And so you can just basically see what their house looked like, what their household furnishings would have been like that didn't burn, and just evidence of the massive destruction of the Romans of Jerusalem. And we saw what they did to the temple and all of the stuff that was knocked down and thrown around. So this is an arc of triumph in Rome that was established by Titus or Vespasian. I don't remember which. I think it was Vespasian. Titus was a general under Vespasian. And along inside of here, I guess it might be this panel on the other side, is this. And this is a celebration of the conquest of Jerusalem. And you see right up here, they've got a menorah. They have captured all of the gold, all of the materials from the temple in Jerusalem, and what they have captured, the amount of gold they captured is so much that it pays for the building of the Colosseum. So when you see the Colosseum in Rome, you can be reminded that it was built with money that was stolen or taken from the Jews after the defeat of Jerusalem. And you see some people up here. This gives you an idea. This part here used to be all the way around. It had collapsed over the years and then was strengthened in a reconstruction effort. But at one time, it was as high as this all the way around and held about 50,000 people. Quite impressive. So Paul's letter to John's Apocalypse of John, which is also the book of Revelation, includes letters to 7 churches. That's right in the beginning, in the first 2 chapters, chapter 2 and chapter 3. And these letters give us some insight into what's going on in the early church in the first century. He writes to the church in Ephesus, and he says they are enduring patiently the suffering for Christ, and they're also struggling with people who are bringing false messages, or messages from false apostles. Smyrna is enduring suffering and poverty, attacks from the Jews, and imprisonment. The church in Pergamon is experiencing martyrdom. That means some of their members are being killed. They have some bad leaders that are leading people into sexual sin and into eating food offered by idols. Same thing in Thyatira, sorry. Sardis, weakness in faith and laziness in Christian practices. Philadelphia, they're suffering persecution from local Jews, and he calls them those who belong to Satan's synagogue. And Laodicea, lukewarm faith, and that's the one, because you're not hot or cold, I'm about to spew you out of my mouth. So these are the things, this is the situation in the early church. Bad leaders, suffering, poverty, attacks from Jews, imprisonment, a lot of negative things going on for the early church. Now, it's during this time that the church is defining itself in the middle of all of this persecution and in the middle of all this hardship. They are defining the roles within the church, establishing the role of the deacon, the elder, the bishop, the structures of the church. They are beginning to work on Christian theology. I have a set of volumes in my office. There's 11 volumes of what's called the Nicene period authors. So many Christian authors are writing at this time. And that's because at this time, there is no textbook, there is no orthodoxy of what Christianity is. And so people are debating, what is the nature of Jesus? In what way is he God? In what way is he man? How does this whole salvation from sin thing work? How does eternal life work? What's the nature of the Trinity? There's a lot of these debates and a lot of cults that start to form. And so these are some of the major ones. Gnosticism is this sort of secret knowledge. You may have heard of the Nag Hammadi texts. That's some books that are similar to books of the Bible, but they are Gnostic books with secret knowledge and secret understandings, and they were discovered in Egypt, a place Nag Hammadi in Egypt, in a wall in 1945, and there's now collections of these. If you're interested, there are books that have all the collected books that were found at Nag Hammadi. It's interesting. There's a fake or a discredited Gospel of Thomas. There's a Gospel of Judas, and some other of these sort of fake Gospels and fake stories about Jesus and his life. So another heresy or cult that's going on, Marcionism, rejects the Hebrew Bible and rejects the God of Israel. And they think that there's two gods, that there's an Old Testament God and a New Testament God, because the Old Testament God is wrathful and the New Testament God is loving. And so that's one of the heresies. Adoptionism, Jesus was not the Son of God, but was adopted at his baptism. And then another one, it's called Docetism, and that they believe that Jesus only appeared to be a man, but he was actually God. And so the problem with this is, of course, if he's on the cross and he's a God and he's not really a man, then he's not suffering. And so these are the ways that people are trying to figure out Christianity and how are we going to do with this and what do we actually believe. That's what's going on in the 2nd and the 3rd century. And at the same time, Christianity is growing like crazy. The experts estimate that in the middle of all this, it's growing at 40% every 10 years throughout the entire time of the 1st and 2nd centuries. So it's expanding dramatically throughout the entire Roman Empire. One of the things they have to deal with is Greek philosophers, and who also are critical. And this is the old, why does God let bad things happen to good people argument? If God is willing to prevent evil, but he's not able to, then he's not omnipotent. If he's able but he's not willing, then he must be evil. Obviously, they don't understand about free will and the importance of free will, God allowing us to have free will and so on. So basically, but what I'm saying is that they're dealing with persecution, but they're also dealing with pressure from without. The Romans are pressing in. Now, here's an interesting thing. When Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments, he finds that the people are worshiping a golden calf. And that's also considered to be Baal, B-A-A-L. By the time we get to the 1st century AD, Baal has become a human being with horns. And he carries a Roman sword and dresses like a Roman. Isn't that interesting? So the Christians are being pressed also by the Romans to accept Roman gods and goddesses. And their refusal leads to bad things. So this is St. Ignatius, not the one of Loyola. This is of Antioch. He is a disciple originally of John, the Apostle John, and then becomes the Bishop of Antioch, and then refuses to accept the Roman gods and is put to death by Emperor Trajan in 117 AD. I'm all right. And is put to death by being eaten by lions in the Colosseum. So it was a real thing that Christians were fed to lions and tigers and burned at the stake as entertainment in the gladiatorial games and the arenas. There are accounts of Christian leaders leading the people in prayer as they're about to be slaughtered. And it's hard to imagine the cruelty of that day when people would consider that sort of thing to be entertainment. As I said, there's an awful lot of persecution and murders that are going on of early Christians. These Christians were executed in celebration of an emperor's birthday. This is one of the worst of all the emperors in terms of persecution, because he passed a decree throughout the entire Roman Empire that Christians had to worship him as Lord, or they could be arrested and put to death. So the result was Christians went underground. In Rome, they worshipped in the catacombs. The catacombs were underground burial sites where these are actually niches where bodies would be placed. And in time, they would, of course, decay. They would stop smelling. You would just find bones. And so it wasn't the worst thing in the world to be down in these things. There are 46 of these around Rome. And St. Jerome, who we'll come back to in a little while, described what it was like to go into the catacombs. We entered the galleries, dug into the bowels of the earth. Rare lights coming from above attenuated the darkness a little. We would proceed slowly, one step at a time, completely enveloped in darkness. What the Christians did in Rome with these catacombs is they would actually turn them into little churches. They would decorate them, as you can see, with Christian images, and they would just have small gatherings of Christians worshiping underground. And here's some examples of art from the catacombs. The image of Christ as the Good Shepherd is a popular one. There are two images here. This is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the burning fires, Adam and Eve, and Jonah being cast out of the boat. So they decorated the catacombs. They worshipped underground for over 100 years. Other Christians retreated to the desert, and they founded monasteries and sanctuaries in the desert. This is one of the oldest in the world. This is St. Catherine's Monastery. For some reason, it survived intact when the Muslims took over the whole area in the 670s and controlled it all the way through the time of the Crusades. They left them alone here. And in these walls was found the oldest complete Bible in history or in existence, and it's called the Codex Cyanaticus. And it is, this is one of the first books. In those days, remember I had showed you how the Bible was originally written on scrolls and on sheepskin, and this is the first actual book that we know of, and it's the oldest Bible. And it should say the 4th century AD, not BC. Sorry about that.
Wow. So Tim,
yeah.
where was that, on parchment, or what was the book made up of? They didn't do paper at that time, did they?
No, it was vellum. Vellum is a very thin sheepskin that is taken and pounded really, really flat. So these are, they're called the Desert Fathers. And this was a common thing. Christians would retreat to these little caves in the desert and spend years just reading the Bible, praying, and living in these little caves. And so Christianity survived underground, out in the deserts, in the fringes of society for all those years, and under continual persecution, and yet growing at the same time. Really an amazing story. It's one of the ways we know God is really in this whole process. So during this time, the Bible, the Old Testament, exists as a single unit. It's been canonized or accepted in 90 AD by a council of Jewish rabbis. But the New Testament is existing, and there are books that you may have known or heard about this. There are books that did not make it into the Bible that were considered to be less than completely inspired by God. And so there were a number of books that were circulating around. And so at this time, Irenaeus is an early Christian father, and he is giving a list of the approved books. At that time, he lists all but 4 of the New Testament books. And then Athanasius is another priest and leader of the church, and he lists all of the books of the New Testament that we know of. And then, and actually, it was 380 that the first time that the 27 books are affirmed by a council of the church as the official Bible. They call it the canon of the Bible. I don't know why they call it that, but that's what they call it. So it's the canon of the New Testament. and it's accepted in 380. This is the New Testament. So the Bible is set Old Testament in 90 AD, New Testament in 380 AD. So the New Testament is written from 5 sources. The reason that Matthew is first in the Gospels is they used to believe that Matthew was written first. But scholars have discovered that Mark was written first, and the way they discovered it was that everything that's in Mark is also found in Matthew or in Luke. Everything except one verse, I think, out of the Gospel of Mark is found in Matthew or Luke, or both. And so they both drew from Mark. But Matthew had his own material, his own recollections, and his own stories about Jesus. Pardon me. Luke had his own recollections and stories about Jesus. They call that the L source and the M source. And so they tell the same stories a lot of times, and they tell them a little bit differently with a little bit of detail difference. And if you ever want to see a good example of that, look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and what are the last words of Jesus on the cross. Each one has a different remembrance of what Jesus' last words on the cross are. So they also find that both Matthew and Luke seem to share another source that's unknown, that's been lost, because they both have the same exact stories that are not found in Mark or in John. And the German word for source is Quelle. And so because it was German scholars that discovered this, it became called the Q source, or the Quelle. And then John has his own material and his own approach, which is a little bit different than the 3 other Gospels, which are called synoptics. And that comes from, optic is the word for eye or seeing, and sin meaning one, and they see with one eye. They tell the story the same way, the same chronology. And John has a little bit different chronology. For example, in John, the cleansing of the temple of Jesus driving out the money changers happens in chapter 3, whereas in Matthew and Luke, it happens at the end of Palm Sunday. So these are the authors of the New Testament and the books that they wrote. And you can see that Paul is the author of most of the New Testament, the majority of the New Testament. Very important leader of the church. And many scholars believe that he wrote Hebrews, but some others don't believe he wrote Hebrews, so they call it undetermined. The book of Hebrews itself says it's written by Paul, but for some reason, the scholars doubt that Paul actually wrote it. So this is, Deb, this is an example of early paper. This is called Papyrus, and it is comes primarily from Egypt because it was developed in Egypt. And what it is it takes the bulrushes from the Nile River, and they flatten them out, hammer them flat, and join them together. And this became their original paper. So there is no whole existing books of the Bible, but there are pages, individual pages that have survived, and lots of fragments that have survived. But that was what it was originally written on, and this is Greek. So this is just a reminder that there were divisions in the early church that Paul was trying to address. And this is his gospel message. The good news is about his son, that's the Son of God, Jesus, in his earthly life, born into King David's line. That's important because for the Jews, it's the Messiah has to be a descendant of David, shown to be the Son of God by being raised from the dead, and he is our Lord. So that's Paul's basic message, and he reaches out to everybody that he can with this message. So I showed this slide last time, but I thought it's worth repeating because it's just such an example of the life of the church. So this thing here on the right side is called the Edicule, and this is where the tomb of Christ is believed to be. There's a little bit of a cave in here. And this is the outer structure. And what I wanted to show you is this is the way that this thing developed. Originally, the cave looks like this. There's dirt on top and then the cave of stone in there. They clear it away to make a church. And here's a better representation. This is the original. They clear it away to start building. There's within this thing right here, there's a little structure that was built over the tomb around 660 AD. This is built around 1000 AD. The outside is built around 1200, and the whole building itself is built around 1550. And that just seemed to be like such a metaphor for the Christian church, because you have your original church, very simple, Jesus the man out in the streets, out in the hillsides, talking to people, and then the church gets more and more built up and more organized and more layers and more fancy, and eventually you wind up with something like this. This is the inside of the church of the Holy Sepulcher, and they use blue dots. You can see the rock, which is, they say, is Golgotha, the part of Golgotha where the cross stood. And right in here, the yellow dot is the circular area where there's a hole where they say that the cross of Christ was placed. And so you can go there and you can reach your hand in. I went there, a lot of people were taking their crosses and touching their cross inside the rock here, because it's the place where the cross of Christ once stood. So you can get down on your knees under this altar and stick your hand in the hole right there with your cross and touch the rock. But obviously you can't chip away a piece of the rock. Everything is protected. So the church initially is formed in 327 by Emperor Constantine's mom. That's the first time that this area is recognized as the tomb of Christ and acknowledged as a place of Christian worship. Over the years, it gets hit by an earthquake and destroyed. It gets destroyed by the Muslims twice. There's a big fire again in the early 1500s. It gets rebuilt again, and it's in its final form now. That was constructed in 1545. So not long after Columbus sailed the ocean blue, that church is built. And Emperor Constantine is kind of the hero of the story. So the Roman Empire, as I showed you last week, is divided up into a couple of areas of control. I don't remember who is in control of Northern Africa over here. But what Constantine does is he unites the entire Roman Empire back into one empire under his rule. And he does that with a final battle there's a river that goes around Rome called the Milvan River. And he has this battle to finally conquer the city of Rome. And that's the last obstacle to reuniting the Roman Empire. And the night before the battle, he's out looking at the stars and he sees a vision of a cross in the sky. And he recognizes that this is a symbol of Christians, and he has several of his troop are Christians, and he has his soldiers are Christians, and he has some priests that are accompanying the soldiers. So he gets one of the priests and he asks him, "What does this sign that I'm seeing mean?" And the priest says, "Well, God is giving you a message that if you will put this sign on the shields of your soldiers, and if you will accept Christ as your Lord, God is going to give you the victory. So he does. And the next day, the defending emperor is planning a surprise attack. There's a pontoon bridge over the river, and the emperor and his soldiers are hiding out underneath on the pontoons, waiting for him to cross. And they're going to, once he comes across the bridge, they're going to come out and attack him and kill him. But there's a big rainstorm up in the mountains overnight, and as they're there waiting on the pontoons, suddenly flash flood comes through, hits the pontoon bridge. The soldiers all get knocked into the water. They're wearing armor. They all drown basically, and Constantine wins the battle without even having to sling a sword. And so he accepts that God has given him this victory. And one of his first acts as emperor is to legalize Christianity. He puts a permanent end to the persecution, and that happens in 312. A short time later, in 325 AD, he convenes a council of bishops. I don't know if they were wearing hats like that in those days. I wonder if that's this probably is a painting that dates to around the 1500s. And that was probably already the attire in the 1500s. But they have a tendency, the painters, to think that everybody looked like them 1,000 years before. So anyway, he gets together the Council of Nicaea, and what they do is they put an end to all the controversies about the nature of Christ, and they come out with what's called the Nicene Creed, which is what we have in our hymnal today. And that answers the questions of what is the nature of Christ, what is the nature of the Trinity, and that's very important. It also establishes Rome as the headquarters of the Christian church. So St. Jerome, I mentioned him in the beginning. I said we're going to come back to him. St. Jerome is the first guy to translate the Bible from Greek and Hebrew into the common language of the people in those days, which is Latin, because the Romans are controlling things and that's their language. So he translates it into the common language, and that's considered to be vulgar for some reason. The common language is considered to be vulgar, so his translation is known as the Vulgate translation. But what he does is, this is his dwelling place, and I'll show you another picture of it in a moment, but where these guys are coming through the door here, that is the place where the birth of Christ took place. That's the cave of the Nativity, the grotto of the Nativity that we looked at last week. And so there's a connecting tunnel between the two, and this is where he lives when he's translating the Bible. I thought, what an amazing thing to actually live in a cave adjoining the cave where Christ was born. So he lived there for about 25 years, and during that time, he completes the translation from Hebrew into Greek, from Greek and Hebrew into Latin, and then he also teaches. And he's pictured with a lion because there's a story that one day when he was teaching some local students, a lion came walking up, limping, and everybody ran away except him. And the lion had a thorn in its foot, and he pulled the thorn out, and the lion then became his friend and stayed with him for many years. And he was also a bit of a philosopher, and here's one of his sayings: good, better, best, never let it rest till your good is better and your better is best. I like that. So here's St. Jerome's cave, and it's been turned into a shrine by the Catholic Church. You can see he's got modern, concrete and stuff, but at one time this is where he lived in very simple conditions and wrote the first translation of the Bible. So it's pretty cool. And so that brings us to the end of our of our time here. And we end with the Emperor Theodosius, who issues an edict making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so that starts a whole new era of Christianity, the end of the early church. And that is that. There we go.
Well, that was great, Tim.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.